The night is quiet now, and as you listen, let us journey together back into the distant centuries when the world was different, yet somehow familiar. The fire crackled in the hearths of monasteries, parchment rustled under the hands of monks, and across the hills of Europe, the bells of churches tolled with a sound that seemed to bind whole communities together. It was the late 11th century, a time when the West, though fragmented and often plagued by feudal rivalries, felt itself part of a single Christendom. Knights rode beneath banners sewn with crosses, peasants worked the soil with devotion and fear of God, and kings, though often quarrelsome, all bent their heads at the thought of eternity. And then, into this world came a voice. A call so powerful that it would stir not only kings and warriors, but even the poorest of shepherds, beggars and women tending their children by the fireside. That voice was Pope Urban II. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, it is said, the air was thick with expectation. The people gathered, clergy and nobles, commoners and lords. And the Pope, rising with solemnity, spoke words that would echo across centuries. He called upon the faithful of Christendom to march east, to free the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim control. Accounts of his exact words vary. Chroniclers wrote of him describing atrocities against pilgrims, of sacred places in the hands of those who did not revere them, of the duty of knights to wield their swords not against their fellow Christians, but in service of God. He promised forgiveness of sins, absolution for those who took the cross. And whether or not his rhetoric was as fiery as later writers claimed, the result was unmistakable. A surge of fervor swept through the assembly. The crowd is said to have cried out, "Deus vult," God wills it, a chant, simple, but like the roar of a great sea, rolling through the hall and spilling into the streets. And in that moment, something shifted in Europe. A crusading spirit was born. Let us pause for a moment here. Imagine yourself among them, perhaps a knight, weary of feudal skirmishes, hearing for the first time of a cause greater than your lord's quarrels. Perhaps a peasant, burdened with toil and taxes, but suddenly told that the road to salvation lies in a journey east. Or a monk, eyes lifted to heaven, whispering that prophecy itself had begun. The word spread quickly. From France to the Rhineland, from Italy to the far edges of Christendom, crosses of cloth were sewn to cloaks, oaths were taken, and families both wept and rejoiced as fathers, sons, and brothers vowed to march. Even women and children joined what became known as the People's Crusade. Led by fiery preachers such as Peter the Hermit, they set out with little discipline, more hope than preparation. Their fate was tragic. Starvation, disease, and attacks along the way decimated their numbers. Some were slaughtered by hostile forces in the east before they even glimpsed the walls of Jerusalem. And yet, despite these early losses, the idea of the crusade could not be undone. It was no longer the dream of a few, but the vow of a continent. The first crusade, led by lords and knights of renown, pushed forward. Among them, were figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, men whose names would be etched in the annals of both glory and cruelty. Their march was long and harrowing, through the heat of Anatolia, across plains where water was scarce and ambushes frequent. But they pressed on, driven by faith, by the promise of land, by adventure, or by the hope of redemption. In 1097, they besieged the city of Antioch, a long, brutal ordeal, months of hunger, of betrayals and treacheries, of cold nights when the Crusaders huddled beneath ragged tents while disease carried away their companions. And yet they endured. Antioch fell, and with it, the Crusaders felt destiny was guiding them, but nothing compared to the climax of their journey. The summer of 1099. Jerusalem, the holy city itself. Imagine the sight, dust rising in shimmering heat as thousands of weary Crusaders finally looked upon its walls. Some fell to their knees. Others raised their swords skyward. Tears mingled with sweat. The siege was desperate. Resources were scarce, tempers short. But determination burned. They built siege towers, battered gates, endured counterattacks. And finally, in July, the walls were breached. The city fell. Jerusalem, after centuries under Muslim control, was claimed by the Crusaders. And what followed was both triumph and tragedy. For the chronicles tell of a massacre, streets running with blood, the cries of the slain echoing against the sacred stones. Yet for the Crusaders, it was proclaimed the will of God. In the great church of the Holy Sepulchre, hymns rose. Knights knelt in armor, their hands clasped, tears on their cheeks. They believed the promise had been fulfilled. God had granted them victory, and thus the Crusader states were born. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch. Western Christendom planted its fragile roots in the soil of the East. But here we must pause once more. For though the Crusaders rejoiced, history teaches us that triumph often carries the seed of future sorrow. Yes, Jerusalem was theirs. But for how long? For beyond the horizon, in the lands of Islam, voices began to stir. The memory of Jerusalem lost was not forgotten. And though the Crusaders basked in glory, shadows were already lengthening. And so we raise the question, what moment truly changed it all? What turning point transformed Crusader confidence into despair and reshaped the destiny of two worlds? The answer lies not in the first trumpet of victory, but in the echoes that followed. And to trace it, we must walk deeper into the centuries that came. For in the years after Jerusalem's capture, the crusading spirit did not fade. Instead, it seemed to glow ever brighter. Knights from across Europe dreamed of adventure in the East. Monks preached with fiery zeal, and kings and princes, though sometimes cautious, could not ignore the allure of holy conquest. The Crusader states became, for a time, beacons of Western hope. Stone castles rose along the ridges and hills, their walls pale against the sun. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem crowned rulers who styled themselves defenders of Christendom. Merchants arrived, Venetian and Genoese ships laden with goods. Silks, spices, glassware, all passed through Crusader ports. And for a moment, it felt as though East and West were entwined in a fragile, glittering harmony. But beneath this glitter, cracks ran deep. The Crusader lords were few in number. Their hold stretched thin over vast and hostile lands. Every castle was an island, every town a fortress surrounded by seas of suspicion. Still, for the common people of the West, the news of Jerusalem's conquest was intoxicating. Pilgrims traveled east in waves, eager to walk where Christ had walked, and Europe itself seemed to inhale new breath. It is said that in monasteries, monks sang with renewed fervor. In village chapels, peasants gazed at painted crosses and whispered tales of distant triumph. Children grew up hearing that the holy city was now in Christian hands. The age of miracles, they thought, had returned. But history, as we know, is rarely so kind. The triumph of 1099 could not hold forever, and soon the euphoria gave way to struggle. The Second Crusade would reveal this. Years after the first, with Jerusalem under fragile Christian rule, Europe sought once more to expand its foothold. In 1147, kings themselves marched. Louis VII of France, Conrad III of Germany. They came not as ragged pilgrims, but as crowned rulers, with banners, heralds, and long columns of armored men. Their armies gleamed. Mail hauberks catching the sun, swords polished bright, standards flapping in the wind. It must have seemed unstoppable. And yet, almost from the beginning, misfortune stalked them. The Anatolian heat scorched the men. Water was scarce. Ambushes struck them as they trudged through hostile passes. Conrad's German army was shattered. Louis pressed on, but with dwindling numbers. When they reached Damascus, their hopes were high. The city was famed, rich with gardens and groves, its waters cooling the desert air. The Crusaders laid siege, but indecision and betrayal undid them. Allies faltered, unity dissolved, and the armies withdrew in humiliation. So the Second Crusade ended in failure. Its echo shook Christendom. For the first time, the great vision of crusading seemed tarnished. God's will, it appeared, was less clear than before. And even as Europe licked its wounds, the Muslim world was stirring. A leader had risen in Syria, Nur ad-Din, devout, austere, relentless. He began to unite fractured forces under one banner. His courts echoed not with feasts of excess, but with prayers and strategy. Step by step, he pushed back. And the dream of a Muslim revival took shape. The Crusaders still held Jerusalem. Their castles stood proud. but they no longer seemed invincible. The tide was shifting, ever so slightly. Let us pause here and imagine the glow of a candle in a stone hall of Jerusalem. A knight in chainmail, setting aside his sword, staring at the flicker of flame. He whispers a prayer, uncertain if the victory of his fathers will endure in the years to come. Because somewhere beyond those walls, in the deserts and mountains of Syria and Egypt, another figure was rising. One who would change the course of history. His name was Salah ad-Din, Saladin. And through patience, strategy, and a vision larger than his lifetime, he would become the answer to the question we raised. The turning point of the Crusades. But before Saladin's star rose fully, the world around him was already shifting. He was born in 1137 in Tikrit, along the banks of the Tigris, a city of ancient stones and winding streets, where caravans passed and soldiers marched. The boy was born into a Kurdish family, one not noble in the highest sense, but one with ties to the service of powerful rulers. It is said his father, Ayub, and his uncle Shirkuh served Nur ad-Din, the stern master of Aleppo. Young Saladin grew in this environment of both scholarship and warfare. Unlike many warriors of his age, he was not at first destined for the sword. Chroniclers tell us he loved study. He delighted in the Quran, in philosophy, in the quiet lessons of scholars. His early years were not filled with clashing steel, but with reflection. And yet, fate had other plans. Nur ad-Din, ever vigilant, required loyal men to extend his influence into Egypt. That land, rich with the Nile, ancient with pyramids and temples long crumbled, had become a prize of immense value. It was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, weakened, fractured, its court a nest of intrigue. And into this world Saladin was sent, accompanying his uncle Shirkuh. Here, history bends. For Egypt was not merely a province. It was the beating heart of resources, grain, and wealth. Whoever held Cairo could project power across the seas and deserts. And through twists of loyalty and chance, Saladin rose swiftly. When Shirkuh died in 1169, the young man was named vizier. A remarkable rise for one still so young. At first, many underestimated him. A quiet scholar, they thought. Perhaps too gentle for the harshness of rule. But Saladin's strength was not in brashness. It was in patience. He observed, he learned, he waited. And soon he dismantled the Fatimid order, restoring Egypt to Sunni Islam under the banner of Nur ad-Din. The Muslims now had a foothold both in Syria and Egypt, a crescent of power that began to encircle the Crusader states. For the Crusaders, who had once marched triumphantly into Jerusalem, the horizon grew darker. Yet even here, let us slow down. Picture the great city of Cairo under Saladin's rise. The call to prayer drifting over the rooftops. Markets alive with spices, incense curling through the air, the Nile gleaming, carrying barges under a golden sun. And in the citadel, a young ruler walking quietly, plotting not for a day or a month, but for generations. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the world held its breath. Would Saladin's loyalty dissolve? Would the fragile unity collapse? But instead, the young leader moved carefully, step by step, until Syria too bowed to his rule. By the late 1170s, he had become the most powerful Muslim ruler of his age. And his dream, his constant vision, was the holy city of Jerusalem. He spoke often of jihad, not merely as war, but as devotion, a sacred duty. Yet he did not rush. For nearly a decade, he consolidated, fortified, and gathered strength. He made truces with the Crusaders when it suited him, and when it did not, he struck swiftly. The Crusader lords, meanwhile, quarreled. Their kingdoms were divided by pride and rivalry. Some were reckless, like Reynald of Chatillon, whose raids provoked outrage even among his own. Others were weak, consumed by internal feuds. And the kingdom itself suffered under leprosy, for its king, Baldwin IV, the so-called leper king, was brave but tragically ill. It was as if two destinies were drawing toward one another. On one side, a patient, united force under a single vision. On the other, a fractured realm, glittering still but fragile beneath the surface. And then came the year 1187, the year of Hattin, the year when the desert winds carried with them the scent of smoke and death, and the fate of the Crusades would be forever changed. But before we step into that battlefield, let us linger a little on the stillness before the storm. The olive groves of Galilee swaying in summer heat, knights polishing armor beneath canvas tents, unaware that doom approached, and Saladin himself, calm, deliberate, gathering his men, his horses, his archers, ready to draw the West into his snare. The summer of 1187 burned fiercely. The sky hung white with heat, the ground cracked beneath the hooves of restless horses. The Crusader kingdom had grown desperate, provoked again and again by Reynald of Chatillon, whose reckless raids on caravans and even Muslim pilgrims enraged Saladin beyond measure. Reynald, daring and arrogant, had broken truces, seizing treasures, mocking oaths. It is said he even threatened Mecca itself, a boast that spread like fire through the Muslim world. For Saladin, this could not stand. The time of patience was over. It was not only war now, but justice. In July of that year, the armies began to move. From the coast, the Crusader host marched under the banner of the True Cross, a relic believed to be the very wood upon which Christ had been crucified. Priests carried it aloft, shimmering in the sunlight, a symbol meant to give courage. The King of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, led them. Beside him stood the proud lords of the kingdom, and among them Reynald, still defiant. Their force was formidable, perhaps 20,000 strong. Knights in heavy armor, infantry, Templar and Hospitaller orders. Yet their strength carried a shadow, for in their haste they marched where Saladin wished. He lured them away from water, away from safety, into the blazing hills near a place known as the Horns of Hattin. Imagine that march. The sun beating mercilessly, armor growing heavier with every step, thirst gnawing at the throat, dust rising, choking, coating the tongue, and at night no respite. For Saladin's forces lit fires around them, the smoke drifting, stinging, denying them even rest. When dawn came, the Crusaders were trapped. Before them and behind them, Saladin's army stretched. Horse archers swarmed like hawks, releasing volleys that darkened the air. The Crusaders tried to push forward, desperate to reach water at Lake Tiberias. But Saladin had blocked the way. The battle raged. Knights charged, lances lowered, the ground trembling under hooves. But each charge broke upon Saladin's ranks like waves against stone. Arrows fell in ceaseless rain. Men collapsed, shields splintered, banners tattered. And thirst was the cruelest enemy. The true cross, borne by priests at the center, became the beacon of last hope. Knights clustered around it, defending it with their lives. But even sacred wood could not quench parched lips, nor turn the tide. One by one, the standards of the Crusaders fell. By afternoon, it was over. The Crusader army lay broken, the field strewn with fallen knights and shattered armor. Thousands were taken prisoner. The true cross itself was seized, carried in triumph to Saladin's camp. King Guy was captured, brought trembling before Saladin, and beside him, Reynald of Chatillon. Here, the chroniclers linger. They tell us Saladin, courteous to the king, offered him water. But when Reynald reached for it, Saladin reminded him he had sworn oaths and broken them. With his own hand, Saladin struck him down. It was said to be both justice and warning. The Battle of Hattin had ended, and with it, the dream of Crusader invincibility. Never again would the Kingdom of Jerusalem stand as proudly as it had before. The tide had turned, and in its turning, all of Christendom would tremble. But the story does not end on the field of Hattin, for what came next would shake Europe to its very soul, the fall of Jerusalem itself. After Hattin, Saladin moved swiftly. The Crusader nobility was shattered, their armies broken, their banners cast down. The castles and towns of the kingdom lay exposed, many without defenders. Like a tide that had long been waiting to rise, Saladin's forces swept through Galilee, through the hills of Judea, through the plains that led to the holy city. One by one, fortresses opened their gates. Some surrendered willingly, others after short resistance. Only a few dared hold out. But Jerusalem, the jewel of the crown, stood yet. The city that had been taken in 1099 with fire and blood was now the prize Saladin longed for. By September of 1187, his army encircled it. Imagine the scene: the walls, weathered by time, rising above the rocky slopes. The dome of the rock gleaming, the church of the Holy Sepulchre casting its shadow. Within those walls, panic and dread. Pilgrims, women, children, refugees, crowded streets and narrow alleys, clutching their belongings, whispering prayers. The defenders were few. Balian of Ibelin, one of the last nobles left, took command. He had sworn not to bear arms, having given his oath to Saladin. But the desperate pleas of Jerusalem's people moved him. He begged Saladin's forgiveness, and the Sultan, respecting his honor, allowed it. So Balian gathered what he could, barely a few knights, some soldiers, and frightened townsfolk who took up arms. The siege began. Saladin's men hurled stones, set up siege engines, and sent waves of arrows against the walls. The sound of drums echoed through the night. The cries of watchmen rang out along the battlements. Inside, fear was a constant presence. Food was scarce, water running low. The memory of 1099 haunted them. They knew what the Crusaders had done then, slaughter without mercy. And they feared the Muslims would answer in kind. But here, history turns with a quieter grace. For unlike the bloody conquest of the First Crusade, Saladin chose a different path. When the defenders realized the city could not hold, Balian sought terms. He met with Saladin in parley. And though at first the Sultan demanded unconditional surrender, he softened. Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps it was strategy, but he offered a way. The Christians could ransom themselves, each man, each woman, each child, freedom in exchange for coin. Those who could pay were released. Those who could not, Saladin allowed others to buy their freedom. And though many still fell into slavery, the massacre that had stained 1099 did not return. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem opened its gates. Saladin entered, not as a destroyer, but as a conqueror fulfilling destiny. He ordered the banners of Islam raised over the city, the dome of the rock cleansed, the Al-Aqsa Mosque restored to prayer, and in the narrow streets, the call to prayer rose once more. For Christendom, the shock was immeasurable. When word reached Europe that Jerusalem had fallen, grief and fury spread. Monks wept in cloisters. Kings bowed their heads. And in village churches, peasants whispered in fear that the end of days was near. Pope Urban II's vision, the dream that had once been realized in 1099, was undone. The holy city was lost. And so the call went out again. Another crusade, greater than those before. The Third Crusade. But for now, imagine the silence after the storm. The streets of Jerusalem dim in the evening light. The gates closed, the banners of the cross lowered. And above it all, the stars returning, as they had long before men fought for the city, and as they would long after. Yet silence in Jerusalem meant uproar in Europe. The fall of the Holy City was more than a military defeat. It was a wound to the heart of Christendom. Pilgrims wept openly, chroniclers dipped their pens in sorrow, and priests thundered from pulpits that the end was surely near. Some whispered that God had turned his face away, others that sins within Europe itself had drawn this punishment. But despair did not last long. Soon the cry for redemption spread. Another crusade, stronger, nobler, led not merely by lords, but by kings. The Third Crusade was born from this grief. 3 great monarchs took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the aged emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Philip II of France, shrewd and calculating. And Richard of England, who would be known forever as the Lionheart. Together, their names promised a tide of steel and fire that might reclaim what had been lost. Frederick was the first to march. Across the mountains, through rivers and valleys, his German host moved with the discipline of empire. Tens of thousands followed, their banners fluttering with eagles and crosses. But fate is often cruel. In 1190, while crossing the river Salif in Asia Minor, the emperor drowned. The shock rippled through his men. Some turned back. Others carried his bones toward the Holy Land, but the mighty army crumbled. So the burden fell to Philip and Richard. Their journey by sea was long and perilous. Storms lashed the ships, hunger gnawed, and quarrels even among allies flared. Yet at last, the Crusader fleets arrived before Acre. Acre, a city by the sea, its walls towering, its harbor guarded. Here, Saladin's banners flew proudly, and here the Crusaders laid siege. For months, the land around Acre became a graveyard of tents and engines. Catapults hurled stones, miners dug beneath walls, archers loosed flights of arrows that darkened the sky. Disease stalked both camps. Summer heat suffocated men beneath iron helms. But neither side relented. Richard arrived in 1191, his presence electric. He was tall, commanding, with a reputation already forged in battles of the West. Chroniclers describe him moving among his men, encouraging, scolding, never idle. He fought even while fevered, carried on a stretcher so he could shoot his crossbow at the enemy. Philip too pressed hard, though his patience wore thin, and at last, after 2 years, Acre fell. The victory was stained. Thousands of Muslim prisoners, unable to be ransomed in time, were executed at Richard's order. The fields outside the city ran red, and the memory lingered like a bitter taste. From Acre, the Crusaders pressed south. Richard led them along the coast, his strategy keen, his knights eager for redemption. At Arsuf, he met Saladin in open battle. The clash was fierce. Saladin's horse archers swirled like storms, but Richard held steady. And when the moment came, he unleashed a charge of knights, that shattered the enemy lines. Saladin withdrew. It was a victory for Richard, yet not a final one. For though he marched within sight of Jerusalem, though his men longed to take the holy city, he hesitated. Supplies were thin. The city was well defended, and winter rains threatened. Twice he turned back, never laying siege. Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp. Instead, Richard and Saladin faced one another not only in battle but in negotiation. And here, too, the chronicles speak of respect. They admired one another, Richard, bold and fierce, Saladin, patient and merciful. Their struggle became legend, and in 1192, weary of endless war, the two agreed to truce. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. But pilgrims could enter freely, their paths to holy shrines unbarred. It was not the victory Christendom had dreamed of, but it was peace, a fragile, fleeting peace. And so, though Richard returned home celebrated, the truth could not be denied. The turning point had already passed. The holy city was lost, and though crusades would follow, none would undo the fate sealed at Hattin and Jerusalem's fall. Yet Europe was not ready to give up. Ambition still burned, and greed too. And the next crusade would not march against Saladin's heirs, but against fellow Christians. Toward Constantinople, the banners that once swore to free Jerusalem now turned toward the Queen of Cities. Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium, a city of golden domes and crowded markets, strong walls and ancient faith. Here stood the Eastern Roman Empire, Christian like the West, yet divided by schism, suspicion, and old wounds. The Fourth Crusade was meant for Egypt, a new path to strike at Islam. But debts, politics, and the ambitions of Venice twisted its course. The Venetians had built the fleet. Their doge, Enrico Dandolo, blind yet cunning, demanded payment. The Crusaders could not meet the price. So Venice offered another bargain. "Help us subdue the city of Zara," they said, "and the debt shall be eased." Zara, a Christian city loyal to Hungary, was besieged. The Crusaders, sworn to protect Christendom, now turned their swords on fellow Christians. The city fell, its walls torn, its people scattered. Already, the crusade was stained. Then came Byzantium's plea. A young prince, Alexios Angelos, promised gold, soldiers, and the healing of the schism if the Crusaders would restore him to his father's throne. It was a tempting offer. The Crusaders, hungry for coin, and Venice, hungry for power, agreed. In 1203, the Crusader fleet reached Constantinople. The sight was overwhelming. Miles of walls rising from the sea, towers gleaming, the city crowned with Hagia Sophia's vast dome. Never had the Crusaders seen such grandeur. But grandeur would not save it. The assault was brutal. By sea and by land, they stormed the defenses. Greek fire roared from the walls, flames licking at wooden ships. But the Crusaders pressed on. At last, Alexios was installed as co-emperor, promises of wealth and unity flowing freely. Yet promises turned to dust. The treasury was empty. The people despised the Latin presence. Riots erupted, fires swept through districts, hatred grew. Byzantium was suffocating under the weight of its allies. In 1204, patience snapped. The Crusaders, unpaid and enraged, turned their fury loose. For 3 days, Constantinople was a hell of fire and steel. Churches desecrated, relics stolen, icons shattered. Nuns violated, treasures carried off, the city bled. Even Hagia Sophia was not spared. Horses were stabled within its walls as chalices were melted for coin. The jewel of Byzantium was broken. From its ashes rose the Latin Empire, weak and short-lived. The true Byzantine emperors fled to Nicaea and Epirus, clinging to fragments of power. But the wound was deep. Christendom had devoured itself, and the dream of Jerusalem slipped further away. For while the Crusaders drank the riches of Constantinople, the Muslim world grew stronger. Saladin was gone, but his heirs endured. And new powers were stirring, beyond even the horizons of the Crusader kings. Far to the east, in the wind-swept steppes, a storm was rising. A storm that would make even the might of Saladin tremble. The horsemen of the Mongols. They were unlike any foe the Crusaders or the Muslim dynasties had ever seen. Swift as shadows, ruthless as fire, their armies stretched farther than the imagination could follow. When they struck, it was sudden, merciless, and absolute. Cities that had stood for centuries crumbled into dust beneath their hooves. In the 13th century, the Mongols surged westward. Baghdad, jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, fell in 1258. The libraries of the House of Wisdom burned, their scrolls tossed into the Tigris until, it is said, the river ran black with ink. The caliph himself was rolled in a carpet and trampled, his empire shattered like glass. The Crusader states watched in awe and terror. For a moment, some hoped the Mongols might become allies against Islam. Envoys were exchanged, letters sent to Europe, even dreams whispered that the fabled Prester John had returned. But the Mongols bowed to no cross. They were their own storm, their own prophecy. When the Mongols clashed with Muslim rulers in Syria and Palestine, the Crusaders stood at the edge, uncertain. At Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mamluks of Egypt met the Mongols. Under Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant commander Baybars, the Mamluks dealt the Mongols their first great defeat. The battle was fierce, the air thick with dust and the cries of war horses. But the Mamluks held their ground, and the tide turned. It was a victory that shook the world. The Mongol advance was halted, and Egypt emerged as the true defender of Islam. From this moment, the Mamluks would dominate the region, and Baybars, once a slave soldier, rose as one of the most formidable rulers of his age. Baybars was clever, relentless and utterly determined to expel the Crusaders. He struck swiftly, dismantling fortresses one by one. Caesarea fell, Arsuf fell, Antioch, once the proud stronghold of the First Crusade, was seized in 1268. Its people slaughtered or enslaved, its churches toppled. The Principality of Antioch was erased, and with it, the crusading dream dimmed further. Still, Acre endured. The last jewel of the Crusader states, crowded with merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers. Its harbors were busy, its towers still defiant. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. For decades more, the city clung to its precarious existence. Europe sent few reinforcements now. The zeal of earlier generations had withered. Kings and princes turned their eyes to nearer quarrels: France, England, Sicily, Aragon. The crusading ideal was fading, replaced by politics, commerce, and weary disillusion. Then, in 1291, the end came. The Mamluks, under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, marched against Acre with overwhelming force. Siege engines thundered, stones crashed into walls, towers crumbled. Inside, panic spread. Merchants scrambled to secure their treasures. Women fled to ships in the harbor. Knights prepared for a last stand. For weeks the city resisted, but the pressure was too great. At last, the defenses broke. The Mamluks surged in, fire and steel devouring the streets. Churches fell silent, the clang of bells replaced by the clash of blades. The last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land was gone. Acre's fall marked the true end. No more Crusader kings ruled in Jerusalem. No more castles overlooked the desert paths. The Holy Land was lost. Yet the memory lingered. The cross and the crescent had battled for 2 centuries, and though the dream of conquest faded, the echoes of that struggle remained. In tales, in songs, in relics carried back to Europe. And in the shadow of Saladin, Baibars, and the kings who had once marched east with hope burning in their hearts. But what was left of that hope? Perhaps only stories. And perhaps, too, a legacy far stranger than any knight or pope could have imagined. For the Crusades, though they ended in failure upon the sands of Acre, left behind currents that flowed through the centuries. Some of these currents were bitter, the memory of bloodshed, the mistrust between East and West, the scars of plunder and betrayal. Others, however, were subtle, unseen, like roots threading quietly beneath the soil. Trade grew where once only pilgrims had walked. Silks, spices, and strange fruits made their way from the Levant into the markets of Europe. Cinnamon and pepper, once rare luxuries, began to flavor the kitchens of lords and merchants. The taste of the East lingered on Western tongues, and so too did knowledge travel, often hidden within the baggage of returning crusaders, merchants, and monks. It was not always deliberate. A scroll taken from a library in Antioch, a medical treatise copied from an Arab physician, astronomical tables glanced at by a curious scholar. Piece by piece, the wisdom of the Islamic Golden Age seeped into Europe. Mathematics, medicine, philosophy, these were not won by sword, but carried by contact. Translations flourished in Spain, Sicily, and Italy. And though the Crusades did not intend it, they became a bridge. A bridge paved with hardship and blood, yes, but a bridge nonetheless. Meanwhile, the image of Saladin grew into legend. Even in Europe, his name was spoken with a kind of reluctant admiration. Chroniclers wrote of his chivalry, his generosity, his honor. In the chansons of France and the tales of England, he was sometimes painted as a mirror of what a true knight should be. It was a strange paradox. This Muslim sultan, feared on the battlefield, yet praised in the stories of those who had fought against him. The idea of the knight, the code of chivalry, the romance of a holy quest, all of these were reshaped by that contact. Though the wars ended in ruin, the myths endured. They fed into the Arthurian cycles, into the ballads sung in castle halls, into the quiet dreaming of a Europe that longed for both faith and adventure. And yet, beneath the songs, there was weariness. The papal calls for later crusades rang hollow. Men remembered the sack of Constantinople, the broken promises, the endless hunger for money. What had begun in fire and zeal under Pope Urban II had ended in ashes. The crusading ideal, once bright as a comet, faded into twilight. Still, destiny had been altered. The East and the West had brushed against each other, clashed, exchanged, wounded, and changed. No one could return to what had been before. Jerusalem remained holy, yes, but no longer the focus of armies marching from Paris or Cologne. Instead, the city lived on in prayers, in pilgrimages, in dreams. And perhaps that was its truest fate. Not a kingdom of steel, but a kingdom of memory. A place where stories would always point, where pilgrims would whisper, where longing would never quite die. In Europe, bards and preachers still spoke of the Holy Land, but their voices carried more melancholy than command. The age of great crusading armies had passed, leaving behind smaller expeditions, flickers of old fire that never caught the wind again. There were the so-called children's crusades, tragic tales of innocence led astray. Boys and girls, moved by faith or by manipulation, setting out with empty hands and trusting hearts. Some believed they would part the seas like Moses, walk barefoot into Jerusalem, and bring it back to Christendom without blood. But their paths ended in misery, shipwrecks, slavery, silence. Whether the stories are entirely true or woven with legend, they reflect a Europe that still dreamed, even as reality slipped away. Later came crusades turned inward. Against heretics in France, the Albigensian Crusade. Against pagans in the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights waged their grim wars. The very word crusade began to shift. No longer bound only to Jerusalem, it became a tool, a banner, invoked by popes and kings alike. But the Holy Land, the Holy Land, remained the beating heart of memory, even as pilgrims walked its roads under Muslim rule, even as merchants traded in its ports. The West kept gazing eastward with wistful eyes. Paintings of Jerusalem hung in monasteries. Maps placed it at the center of the world. And every Easter, when bells tolled, the thought of the empty tomb stirred once more. Yet, in quiet corners, some asked different questions. Had God truly willed the slaughter? Had the blood of innocents, of Jews in Rhineland cities, of Greek Christians in Constantinople, been justifiable beneath the banner of the cross? There were no easy answers, but the doubts marked a change, a softening, a recognition that not all zeal was holy. Meanwhile, in the East, the Mamluks ruled firmly. Their citadel in Cairo stood tall. Their fleets patrolled the coasts. Their armies guarded the gates of the Holy Land. They built mosques, schools, caravanserais. And though Crusader castles still dotted the hills like broken teeth, they were ruins now, filled with sand and silence. Time smoothed the scars, as it always does. Children played where once armies clashed. Fields grew again where blood had soaked the soil. The rhythm of daily life returned, as if history itself had taken a deep, long breath. But for storytellers, for monks with quills and travelers with weary feet, the Crusades never truly ended. They became parables, warnings, inspirations. They lived on in ink, in parchment, in stained glass, and whispered tales, a tapestry woven from both triumph and tragedy. And so we drift, gently, to the final reflection. That the turning point of the Crusades was not only Hattin, nor Acre, nor Constantinople's fall. It was the moment when dreams collided with reality, when faith met fire and ideals dissolved into dust. The dream of Christendom united in holy war gave way to the truths of politics, greed, and human frailty. And yet, even in that disillusionment, the world was reshaped. The Crusades had pulled distant peoples into contact, had opened roads once thought impassable, had sown seeds that would sprout in strange and unexpected ways. For Europe, locked for centuries in its own feudal rhythms, the glimpse of broader horizons could never be forgotten. Ships that once carried knights and pilgrims soon carried merchants. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew rich on the tides of the Mediterranean. Markets blossomed where East and West touched hands. Perfume, glasswork, carpets, and knowledge all became part of a new weaving. The Crusades had failed in their holy mission, but succeeded in knitting the continents closer. In monasteries, monks copied texts brought from the East. Aristotle's words returned, clothed in Arabic commentary. Numbers once strange, the zero, the decimals, the algebra of al-Khwarizmi became tools of European scholars. Medicine, astronomy, philosophy, all whispered through the parchment corridors. Slowly, quietly, the Renaissance was being prepared. But if Europe took, it also gave. Latin liturgy, Frankish customs, the echo of Gothic arches, they left impressions on Levantine soil. Even in defeat, the Crusaders left behind fragments, shards of themselves embedded in the stones of Acre, in the memories of Damascus, in the songs sung by merchants on caravan routes, and Jerusalem itself. It endured neither fully Christian nor wholly Muslim, nor ever entirely one thing. It remained a city layered with longing, contested yet sacred, eternal in its capacity to inspire. So what was the turning point of the Crusades? Was it the blazing sun at Hattin, where nights collapsed upon the parched earth? Was it the trembling surrender of Jerusalem, when walls echoed with prayers of both fear and forgiveness? Was it the flames of Constantinople, when brother turned upon brother and Christendom tore at its own heart? Or was it Acre, final and terrible, the closing of the last gate? Perhaps the answer is not in a single battle or city. Perhaps the true turning point was inward. A recognition, slow and heavy, that zeal cannot overcome distance, division, and time. That even faith, fierce as fire, bends beneath the weight of human need. Still, the Crusades remain. Not as victories, not as failures alone, but as a story of men and women swept by forces larger than themselves, of deserts and mountains crossed, of candles burning in chapels, of steel flashing in moonlight, of dreams both noble and terrible. And as the centuries rolled on, that story softened. The cries of war grew faint, replaced by whispers. By the hush of pilgrims' prayers, by the rustle of turning pages in libraries, by the calm voice of storytellers retelling what had once shaken the earth. And now, as you listen, perhaps with eyes heavy and breath slow, that story folds itself closed. Not abruptly, not harshly, but like the final note of a hymn fading into silence. The turning point of the Crusades was not just a battle, not just a city, but the reshaping of destiny itself. A path once walked with fire and steel, now remembered in quiet words. Rest now. Let the voices of the past drift into dreams. For their struggles are long ended, their battles turn to dust. And in the stillness of history's night, all that remains is the gentle echo, a reminder that even in conflict, the human heart forever longs for peace. And yet, peace is not silence. It is the soft murmur of rivers over stone, the slow unfurling of dawn across the hills, the hush of cloisters where monks whisper prayers for a world too vast to hold. Peace lingers like candlelight at the edges of shadow, steady, quiet, enduring. Perhaps the men who rode east with the cross upon their tunics never found it. Perhaps the sultans who defended their lands, who raised banners beneath the crescent moon, also never held it fully. But in the end, the memory of their striving teaches us something. That even in the most violent of storms, humanity yearns for a gentler horizon. Close your eyes if they are not already heavy. Imagine the citadel walls of Acre now crumbled, softened by time. Imagine the broken towers where grass grows through stone. No more clash of swords, no more fire of siege engines. only gulls circling above, waves washing endlessly below. The story drifts further, dissolving into quietness. What remains is not fear, nor rage, nor victory, only the echo of a path once taken, a turning point long past, and the soft comfort of knowing that the world, despite all, continues on. Breathe deeply now. The past is far away. Its dust settled, its cries faded. You are safe here, listening, resting. And the story has done what stories are meant to do. It has carried you gently, and now it lets you go. Sleep, if you wish. Let the long shadows of history fold around you like a cloak. For the knights and sultans are gone, and only stillness remains. Good night, and may peace, the peace they sought but never found, be yours.